we get to George Washington?
Yeah, we
Just got.
And George Washington, second son, very intelligent person. But the thing about Washington, he didn't have the classical English education. He didn't want to be an English gentleman. He didn't have that education. So he knew how to survey, which is a very valuable skill. He could make maps, but he didn't have that classical English education. A country gentleman in England would do things like knowing the classics, Greek and Roman literature, and speak what language? Yes.
French.
French. They all had to speak French. That was Louis XIV kind of said this thing where, wow, the French, it's, you know, how, it's got to be in this tile. In this tile, or the earth spins off its axis. That's science. Just as the sun goes around the earth, that's the earth. See, we're learning a lot here, aren't we? So Washington did not, do we have this? We had all this, right, and death and speculation, sound effects. So I think we're right here, right? So Washington already went once. They sent it back now, Lieutenant Colonel Militia, and he is going to be the first one to survey the land. And think about what that would do for a speculator. He's the first one there and can make the map and can survey. He can get the best claim and get rich. This is what Washington's thinking. I will get there first. He wants to get rich. He wants to be an English gentleman, yet he didn't have the education. And he wants to be an officer in the British Army. Those are his goals. And most of the officers, you know, they were the second or third sons of noblemen, and that's what he wanted to be. That was his total goal. In fact, ideally, he would have liked to have got rich in the colonies and then bought a country state in England and go back. I know it's kind of weird to think about George Washington in that way, but that's what he wanted. Okay, not the getting rich part. That seems to kind of fit. And so he is going to take a couple hundred militia, and also there's a tribe here called the Mingos that have been allied with the British against other groups, fierce fighters, and they're going to cut their way from Alexandria. So we did not talk about this yesterday, right? From Alexandria to the headwaters of the Ohio, where the Allegheny and the Mahonga run together. That's the Ohio River. And they're going to have to climb over the mountains. There's just a trail. They're going to widen it to about this wide. So they're going to cut their way through. And I want you to think about these guys for a second. They're told, okay, this is your job. You're going to pack your gear and walk 500 miles and cut a road through the forest. Yeah. And they're like, okay, let's do it. And they just go. They might wind it down across the street. And they just cut their way through the forest. So one thing to remember about the people back then, they were kind of a different breed. I mean, they just were expecting these kind of hardships. Kind of a tougher, stronger breed, different generation, 5 generations. That's what I grew up with. Every day, cutting a road. So they went, and even though Washington had been out there in this territory, and had very experienced people with the Mingos under their kind of the warrior chiefs, having half king, they knew that the French allies were watching them the whole way. And when they got there, there's a big French presence, and other tribes like the Shawnees, the Hurons, they're allied with the French. When they got there, they found the headwaters of the Ohio River. They marched there. There's a French fort. The French had beat them to the punch and built a fort called Duquesne, right along right along the Allegheny River, right there where the Ohio River starts. Now it's a park. They had this fort, and the fort. So I got Duquesne. I'll show you a picture of the fort. It's a star fort, wood and earthen mound. Eventually they make stone fort. This is the way they would make forts here: angled walls, the new style, so cannonballs bounce off essentially. And Washington knew, I can't take that fort. He had no idea how many French soldiers were in there, if they had cannon, how many allies. He's in real trouble. His problem is he knows if he goes back, it'll be another year, maybe 2 years before that expedition. Virginia might be late, Britain might get there first, the French might hold out, but more importantly to Washington, this might be his best and only chance. To get that land, he is feeling desperate. So they pull back and they're in the woods, and a French column, just a few men. They're not really dressed in uniform, you know, they're clearly French soldiers, but they are dressed much like Hurons, so half clothed essentially, and they're marching towards Washington. And Washington scouts pick them out, and he decides to ambush them. He decides to attack the French because he doesn't know what else to do. And this will be known as the Schumannville Affair. Schumannville was their commander. So it's in these rugged woods. This is where the Park Service has this laid out. It's called Schumannville Glen. And it's got these rugged cliffs. You know, the old Appalachian Mountains have a lot of these just jagged cliffs just because of the erosion over millions of years, and heavily forested. So he attacked just before sundown. And so by the time this quick sharp fight, most of Jumonville's men were taken prisoner. So just imagine, sun is down, it's dark, couple fires, it's gloomy. The countryside looks like this, sharp fight. Here's a woodcut of Washington from the 1770s. I just thought that was kind of amusing, so I put it up there. They captured Jumonville. And Jumonville, Washington, actually, once they captured Jumonville, Washington didn't know what to do. You know, it's like, well, now what? And so he captured them and decides to interrogate them to find out how many men are in this fort. And so think about it, dark, gloomy, there's a few men wounded, there's, you know, agony, really a confusing time. Oh, he ambushed them. I forgot to tell you this. The British colonists called the French colonials Canadians. And so that's where you get, you look at the spelling, you notice there's an E. So those are French Canadians. That's how so that's what they called them. And that was a kind of a bastardization of about 3 different words where they came up with Canada. But Washington is trying to interrogate. And you can imagine Jumonville, hands tied behind his back. He is hand tied behind his back, on his knees, dark, gloomy forest. You're going to be Jumonville. Okay, so be ready. Or don't be ready to be better actor. So act like you don't know what's coming. So he's on his knees, and Washington's interrogating him. What's the problem?
He doesn't.
No. So Washington is how many men? And Jumonville is yelling back in French. And Washington doesn't know what to do, but he doesn't want to admit he doesn't know French. So what does he do? He yells louder in English. And so they're screaming back and forth. Well, Half King, the head of the Mingos, is standing there watching this, and he's this. We were on our way to go get loot and catch prisoners and hold it for ransom. And I'm tired of this argument, and this is bugging me. So just imagine, Washington here, you're Jumonville. They're yelling back and forth. Half King is holding a war club. So imagine a big, thick piece of wood with a polished rock. He's holding this. And finally decides to end the argument. And so as Jumonville is yelling, you speak French. Okay, so yeah, comes up and Jumonville's in the middle of a word, takes a club and bang, right there in the back of the head. Jumonville's head splits wide open. Blood goes everywhere. Absolutely. I mean, you can imagine just chaos. Like this. Washington's covered with blood. And then Half King on the body of Jumonville, who is still moving, sticks his foot on part of the skull, rips open the skull, pulls out the brain, and begins to wash himself with the brain. Washington has lost control of this. People are just going nuts, running around. Half King is like this. Jumonville lays there dying. Yes, that was fatal. And then, but a few of the men are able to escape. They get to Fort Duquesne, and now Washington knows I'm in real trouble. I just started a war. Now, what does he do? So the he knows I can't really run. I can't get, maybe individually, but So they go to a little clearing at the bottom of a valley about 10 miles away. And, stuff I already told you. And they build, this is actually a plaque from, and I thought this was funny. They're building a fort, and when you call a fort necessity, you're in trouble. So they couldn't build a wooden stockade as quick as they can, knowing that the French will be coming out of Duquesne, and they have no idea how many French. No idea. And they built it, it's hard to see here, but it's a low valley. There's hills surrounding it. It's a terrible place to build a fort, but that shows you his desperation. And they have no water supply. The fort, it's a national park here. They've rebuilt the fort. So this is a rebuilt. So it's just a crude wooden stockade. The French surrounded a sharp fight. Washington's men begin to take casualties. They're running out of water. They're running out of ammunition. And Washington realizes he's in real trouble. If he fights and stays and fights to the death, well, I guess he won't become that English gentleman. But if he surrenders, he's going to be humiliated. But he finally decides he's got to surrender. So at Fort Necessity, Washington would surrender. And so he's going to be given a surrender document with terms. Sometimes you might see this called conditions, and this was really common in war. Basically, the agreement is, okay, we agree to quit fighting. The Virginians realize we're doomed. The French realize, okay, we can kill them, but we might lose more men. We are conditioned. So basically, the Virginians agreed, and Washington agreed. We surrender, we quit, and then we'll walk home. French won. No more bloodshed. Conditions like this were really common in war. Why murder each other when we know one side is going to win? Especially back then. This is called conditions. If there's no conditions, it's called unconditional surrender. The victor decides. But here are conditions. So Washington is given this document. So here's this document. And it's written out. It's right here. There's Washington's signature right there. He's given this document, and Washington does one that. Then signs it. What's the problem? He has no idea what he just. But he didn't want to admit it. That's Washington has that flaw his whole life. He never wants to admit he made a mistake. And so Washington didn't read it. And in it, Washington agreed that he was ordered to assassinate Schumannville on the order of Virginia and the king. So he was ordered to assassinate Schumannville, and he admitted he knew Schumannville was a diplomat on a mission of peace. Now that wasn't really true, but Washington signed the document. This gave the excuse for the French to attack all along the frontier. Remember what I told you, the French were thinking preventative war. Now the war probably would happen anyway, so you can't say George Washington, without Washington there would have been no war. But isn't that weird that George Washington, 22 years old, start the French and Indian War that would lead to the revolution, that would lead to the founding of the United States, eventually the Constitution, and who would be the first president of the United States? He planned this. His whole life, Washington's waiting for that opportunity to start the war. Someday I'll be president. Yes. That's good. Yeah, never met him. Still around, huh?
He's 22.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. It's pretty amazing. Obviously, he planned it. It's just weird how this whole series of events happened. Well, the British are humiliated. Here's the thing, though. The King George II, decides they decide, let's take out the French right now. After this humiliating victory. And the very next year, almost forgot, this would start the French and Indian War. Eventually, it would, in 2 years later, unlike the other wars, it would go to Europe. So this one started in what is now Pennsylvania. And it would go to Europe as a 7 Years' War. Yes, creative name. And this would be a bloody, confusing battle. Mostly everybody attacked Prussia. Basically what happened. But 1755, the British sent trained soldiers who fought in the War of the Austrian Secession under General James Braddock. Braddock brought a regiment of 1,000 men and about 800 militia and Mingo. Washington would command the militia. He got a second chance, which is pretty rare because he had been there before. And Braddock followed basically Washington's route. And this is actually from the Mount Vernon webpage, Washington's home. Eventually he'd marry the richest woman who was a widow in Virginia. He got his wish. He got to be the richest, one of the richest people in the country and in the US. Braddock is going to march here, and they had to cut the road. And Washington warns them, the French aren't going to use tactics like Europe. Braddock was experienced fighting in nice broad fields in European style fighting. Not the tactics of the frontier. Hit and run, use cover, retreat when larger forces come, swirl behind. Now, during the Napoleonic Wars, 1810 or so, this would soon be dubbed guerrilla. So that's what the French use. You notice it's not gorilla, it's guerrilla. It's a Spanish term. And so the French were basically using the same tactics that the American Indians would fight each other in these kind of relatively limited conflicts. And here, one of the allies of the French, you know what tribe that is? Here. And see the hair? Citizens of the United States today, for whatever reason, call that a what? Okay, I actually know why. No, the Mohawk did not wear their hair like that. Mohawk didn't wear any hair here. Huron, Mingos and others didn't have this. But in World War II, American paratroopers were training, and they were thinking they're going to use the same guerrilla tactics, and they were inundated with the new Western movies of the time. And so they thought, we're going to fight like American Indians. And so they started using things like, we jump on the plane, we yell Geronimo. And that's to be training in Arizona. And that's where Geronimo would try to make his last stand. And so they started cutting their hair like they thought American Indians, at these paratroopers did, and they dubbed it Mohawk, and the name stuck. Mohawks, no hair here. I know how they did that. Oh, they didn't shave it. This is to show you're an adult, yes.
They did it, so they had it like that so that their bald heads line their pennant.
That's actually a good guess, but. So, I'm looking for the hair that'd be perfect. Okay, this is gonna hurt you, but not anyone else, okay? They would grab the hair like this.
Would they scalp?
And yank it. Pull it out. And I don't mean like pull hair by hair, yank it like this. So what's going to happen? It's going to pull it all the way to the bone. So grit your teeth. You can bite your pencil. So they pull the hair out, and they just end up with this bumpy skull. Yay! I do like to blind the enemy. That was good. But that's how the Mohawks did it. Whatever. You know, it's one of those things that World War II, and they just misname things, and it's weird how those kind of things stick. Well, 17th century tactics for or 18th century tactics for army was a heck of a lot different than what they're fighting on the frontier. The 18th century was, okay, we have weapons that aren't very accurate. These were actually called brown bests. They were smooth bore. They're muzzle loading, so you actually would have to drop the musket ball in, put powder, and then use a ramrod to tap it down. That is what he's doing right here. The thing is, they want the barrel a lot bigger than the musket ball so they can do it fast. And so when they fire, the musket ball is actually going to kind of bounce in the barrel. So where's the musket ball going to go when it leaves the barrel? Yeah. So maybe accurate to 50 yards. And so if you're only accurate to 50 yards, you better have a whole line. So these are British reenactors. And so if you all fire together, at least one of you are going to hit something else. And what's your enemy going to do? Here is the Battle of Blenheim, and here are the French and the British lined up in their lines. The enemy's gonna line up 40 yards away. And you're gonna blaze in each other's faces. At 40 yards, you can see their eyes. You can see the firing, you can see them load. And this is black powder, so you can almost see the bullets fly, yeah.
Were there actually blaze down the bike of run? What was the purpose of it?
It gave timing for the march.
Okay, so basically you have someone waiting and it's for and signal where that announces their presence. That seems really stupid today. Was it considered rude to shoot enemies from the boy? Okay, now
Yeah, they were just in the way.
okay, now it's just the plain idiomatic.
No, you wanted to, you march, the whole idea of it was, we have to march in these nice straight lines, so we need to have, they started marching, first they had like 14-foot pikes. That's where it comes from. And if you're carrying a 14-foot pike, you better all marching in step. Because if you don't march in step, when someone falls. So that's where the whole idea of the drum before comes. Somebody, so you all keep step and march. So you keep your line square. Yeah, it was crazy, those poor 10-year-olds with the drums. But yeah, that was true. And so with that, very far. Now, there were muskets with barrels. What do you call the grooves inside a barrel? Yeah, that's the term rifle. The problem with that is the musket ball had to fit tight. So it takes a lot longer to load. You don't want that for the military. You want to load fast. So rifling might be used for hunting in the frontier, but you might get one round off every minute and a half. Smoothbore, a trained soldier could do this 3 times in a minute. But I think you might see one other problem. Just imagine standing there 40 yards from the enemy and doing this. What are they doing while you're loading your musket? Shooting at your face. What is the rational thing to do if somebody is shooting at you? Run. So what was discipline like in these armies? You turn your head and you're beat. You march out of step, you're beat. You drop your ramrod, you're beat. Their discipline is harsh. They weren't swimmers. They would rather face an enemy bullet than run and get beaten. They'd be wheeled. That was another one where they turn a wagon up on its side. They would tie your thumbs to the wheel and your feet and spin you until your thumbs get ripped off. Potentially. Anybody else want to duck?
Wait, so what would they do?
So they have a wheel, you know, the wheel, big wheels for a wagon. They would tie your thumbs to the wagon. Hang you. Sometimes just hang you and maybe spin you back and forth. Sometimes give it a spin. The whole point is to make an example for everyone else. But who's not trained like that? Militia's not trained like that. Militia are citizens. And what are militia going to do if someone's like shooting at their face? So militia always runs. So regular soldiers always don't like militia, but militia make very rational decisions. I don't want to die. I should have. If anyone's thinking about joining the military or know anybody who did, and they have that first bit of basic training, that's what basic training is, to teach you to act irrationally. That's what it does, to follow orders, because it's not rational. We can argue, wait a minute, what else are you going to do? Yeah, that's another point, but it's still not rational. And when the enemy begins to waver and men begin to get hit, some begin to run, that is when they would make their musket into a pike by fixing a what? What do you call the blade again? A bayonet, and charge. And people don't like to be stuck with bayonets, especially militia. So that was the tactics. But you see the problem, you want to make these nice lines. Here are Prussians, here are British soldiers. Here is, I thought this was a comical thing from a video game, more reenactors. This is a battle of the War of Austrian Secession. You need nice broad fields. Those didn't exist in Pennsylvania. And that's what Washington tried to tell Braddock. So Braddock's men are marching. Oh, why did they wear bright colors? Why did the British wear red? Say it again. I have heard people say that. Black powder is so smoky, they needed bright colors so they could see their men. And so that's why they all wore bright colors. And during the English Civil War, there was a whole warehouse full of red cloth. And so they wore red. And that's the only reason why they wore red. There's blue, there's white, there's green uniforms. That's what they wore. What did the French wear? Most of them fought in the summer naked. Just tanned. Pretty good camouflage. And hid. Don't get bogged yourself down with details. Okay, moving on. So the Battle of Mahonga, the British are marching, hoping to find this big clearing. Instead, they're stretched out over 1,000 men over 4 miles along a path. And what did the French and the Hurons do, and the Shawnee and the Pawnee? They ambushed them, and it was a disaster. Braddock couldn't organize his men. They're in the forest, and here are Huron attacking them. Braddock tried to organize his men, and he was mortally wounded. A horrible defeat. 1/3 of the British and militia forces were destroyed. Washington organized a rear guard action. He did actually save over half of the men, but he got no credit. Partially because nobody gets credit in a defeat, but also the British didn't want to admit that Washington was right. You can't fight the same way. Nobody likes somebody who was right, and therefore a disaster. Washington would fight in the militia for the rest of the war and would come out getting no credit he thought he deserved. Yes, he would scoop up some land, but that's another story. Very, very rich widow, but he had a lot of resentment. Built and built. And there's nothing more corrosive than when somebody feels slighted and that resentment builds and builds, and they think about it and they get angry. All of us have probably felt slighted by somebody and felt angry. They just build on it. In fact, it's best when the person you're mad at doesn't really know why, so they just build and build. Or someone might think that about you. It's really corrosive, that kind of resentment. It's like one of the most corrosive things there is. And so Washington, more and more, I want revenge. That might come down the road. So it looks like the French are riding a high, but they're still outnumbered. And then in 1756, the 7 Years' War, Part B of this would break out across France, and now, across Europe, and France is now occupied fighting the Prussians. The Prussians are fighting France, Austria, and Russia. But they're winning these series of battles. This is where Frederick Great would have some of his biggest victories. And now France is occupied here, and Britain can pick off French colonies. Like, for example, here, and in India. And a new leader in Parliament, because King George II was not very active. Parliament, the House of Commons, was having a greater role, and they're starting to call it the Prime Minister, the leading minister of Parliament. And its name was William Pitt. Sometimes you see him as Pitt the Elder, because there'll be a Pitt the Younger. And he organized British victory. And one of the big things he did is just give money to Prussia. So Prussia can keep fighting the French, and now the French are occupied. And then the British can hit them in the periphery. Attack harbors, attack bases, but get new friends. And this is going to be expensive. And people are saying, oh, we'll have to pay it back. He didn't care. Borrow money now in the form of bonds. Build up a debt, and after the war, we'll worry about paying it back. Victory is more important. Because he understood that if they won the war, they'll be in such a good financial position that debt will be relatively easy to pay. I should add the debt will be in gold, and that might be problematic. Bonds are how governments borrow money. They issue bonds, and people buy them. You get a piece of paper. Basically, it's an IOU from the government. I'm stealing your notes again. And it'll say, I owe you, let's say I'm the government, I am the government. And I want to borrow money. So it says $100 bond, I owe you, you buy it, you give me $100. You can loan the money to the government. And when it matures, this piece of paper, so it might be 3 months, might be 6 months, might be 30 years. In 30 years, the government must buy that bond back, but not just for $100 plus what? Interest. And that's how the government borrows money. Now, if you trust the government, you say in 30 years, that government's going to be here and strong and collecting taxes, the interest will be low. It's just a safe investment. If you're not sure, you think I might collapse, or Calandia might collapse, the interest will be high. That makes sense to everybody? Let's say our interest might go up for a while, but when people think we win, our interest will go down, and in the long run, we'll clean up. And people think the French are going to lose. What's going to happen to their interest? And after the war, the French will be in bigger trouble. So he's saying, roll the die. So much of war is finance. What do we call US government bonds? So when the United States government borrows money, and governments cannot function, when I say borrow money, every government's in debt. What do we call them? Say it again. No. Good guess. I know, good guess though. They're called, but we have the Treasury Department issues them, so they're called Treasury Bills, or sometimes you might see them called T-bills. T-bills, those are US government bonds. And the Treasury Department will have an auction and they'll sell them a couple times a year. And that's how the US government borrows money. And it's a pretty good deal because, well, is the interest that the US government has to charge today, is it low interest because people think the US government will pay it back, or is it high interest? Rock bottom. It is so low, it's almost negative. Thank you. I'm not here. It's a really safe investment, but it's not a big return because the US government has always paid back its debt. So the interest is really, it's like, it's so low that it's actually negative. It's in real terms, it's negative. So it's kind of amazing how cheap money is for the US government to borrow. So that's how you know a government is safe, that interest rate. If the interest rate goes up, that's like, uh-oh, something's bad. People don't trust that government to be around. So for example, the attempted overthrowing the insurrection on January 6, 2001, that could have severely, that's in 2001, 2021, sorry. That could have if that could have succeeded, I bet interest rates would have settled. Because people would have lost faith in it. Oh, because if you can have one coup, you can have another coup. And then, who knows? A year and a half ago, there was an attempt that, yeah, overthrowing the government, that's the definition of a coup. I don't even want to think about what would happen. It would have been, I don't know, it would have been bad. It would have been really bad. There's so many what ifs, let's not get to them, so it would be too scary. So with that, the French now, their whole goal is to hold out to the treaty. They want to win here, but now they know because of the Royal Navy, they can't get supplies here. So whatever they have here, they're basically stuck. So the French have to rely on militia, and they're, remember, way outnumbered. One more thing, the French fleet, there was a pretty powerful French fleet down here. But it's about this time of year, it was going to make a sortie up to here, sail up here. What season is it down here in September, October? Hurricane season. How did you know a hurricane was coming in 1758? 100-mile-per-hour winds. Just, whoa, wind. Can you imagine what a hurricane would do to a sailing vessel? it destroyed a whole French fleet. So hurricane season might be a problem. I wonder if this will have influence on. That's what we call it, foreshadowing. So with that, so now the British are going to get Quebec, and that became their plan. If we could take the capital of New France, Quebec, we can win this whole thing. Now it's going to be really hard to do. They're going to have to take the Royal Navy ocean-going vessels and sail up the St. Lawrence River. Now, St. Lawrence River is a mile wide, but still heavy current. So they have to basically like tack up the river or have guys in rowboats row and pull the boats up the river. Good times. And they'll have to go here. And the French know there's only a few months. It's winter. Or it's winter 10 months of the year up there. There's a limited window. And if the British are caught up here in November without not being in the city, they're doomed. And so this is a really risky operation. So the French or the British sail up here under maybe their most famous general of this era, one of the most famous generals in their history, James Wolfe. And the French commander and the royal governor, Louis Montcalm. And Montcalm is outnumbered, but no, winter. Hold out till winter. Quebec is a really good place to hold out. Wolfe versus Montcalm. Wolfe, in some ways, is better. Montcalm is a brilliant organizer, but he has a shortage of men and equipment. So let's go back to here. Here's where Quebec is. It sticks out on the peninsula, and it's a fort. And then it's along high cliffs all the way down the river. And then here, the St. Charles River, it's a swampy, marshy area. And so it's a great place to defend. So the British, if they land here, they get bogged down in the swamp. If they go down here, they got to get past the guns and go up a cliff. And the river is really wide. Wolfe gets here in August and doesn't know what to do. They can attack here, but there's still a big river. Winter is coming. If he finally decides to sail down here and land here. The problem is there's 50-foot sheer cliffs. And here's what the cliffs look like from across the river. It's a beautiful place. If you ever get a chance, go to Quebec. It is kind of shocking how pretty of a place that is. Go trip? Yeah. Yeah. Hop on the yellow school bus. You guys take off. I'll meet you there. Here's the fort. This is a big field called the Plains of Abraham. But when Wolfe got there, they're on this cliff, and he's like, do we leave? We can't stay on this little narrow shore and the cliff. But some of his men were noticing that French women who lived in a little village above were somehow making it down the cliff, washing their clothes and getting back up the cliff. And a couple of their pickets, scouts, watched them. They kind of floated down the fall. They saw that sort of like they're witches. No, they're floating down. They washed and they let it go back up. And they went to the spot and they couldn't really see it, but it was a mountain goat trail that they widened a little bit, that kind of switched back their way. If you ever walk down a cliff and see the mountain goat trail, I think you probably know what I'm talking about. I mean, you don't even see it, then, oh, there's a trail there. And then he sent over 4,000 men up that trail. And out in the middle of the night. I always just imagine these guys, the first guys like, the cliff, and then they pour it over the top. The first men they hung ropes with torches, and the other men came up, they pulled up with ropes, the cannon and horses. And the next thing you know, there's 4,400 men out there on the Plains of Abraham, and Montcalm's, they weren't supposed to be here. It's September 1759. 4,400 British soldiers approximately, around 3,300, but half the French soldiers are militia. And what do militia do? If it's going to be a set battle. And now they're going to expect the militia to stand up to bayonets. Montcalm stays in the middle with the militia, hoping to rally them. But he decides to attack, thinking the British have to be exhausted. And he is mortally wounded. Mortally wounded. Ironically, so is Wolfe. But when the militia hear that Montcalm is wounded, the militia run. The French line collapsed. Quebec falls. decisive is not strong enough. You'll find out something about portraits, a lot of portraits at this time. So Wolfe is going to be glorified, immortalized, is a better way to put it. Here is Wolfe's death, one of the more famous pictures. This is it. This is in Sandhurst, their military academy. West Point copies that. And look how they draw Wolfe, who's in his late 30s. You find this in portraits at this time, all the way up to photography. Anybody, male or female, who's like, 40 years and younger, so young adult, they make them look like 12 or 13-year-old girls. Right? Older than that, male or female, then make them look like, senior citizen age women. And if you don't believe me, look at a dollar bill and look at George Washington. They try to soften the features, and that is the net effect. I guess I was seeing this more attractive. And you notice that. With that, the French cannot hold. And eventually the Treaty of Paris, the decisive British victory. And to show how decisive it was, all land east of the Mississippi, all this, including Spain, because Spain was a French ally, went to Britain. A massive victory. The French threat is gone. Also, don't write the islands down. I put them in italics so I don't forget them. I kept forgetting them, so I wrote them down. The French kept 3 islands down here, and these were decisive in the Revolutionary War. They could have kept New France or the islands. They kept the islands because of sugar. Looking back, that might have been a bad mood, considering how wealthy of a place Canada is going to become, an incredibly wealthy country, which it is today, and polite. And lastly, Spain got the claim to Louisiana. France gave them the claim, so Britain wouldn't get it. This would have kind of an impact down the road on the new United States. Yeah, that's one of those. So, George Washington got all of that done. Pretty amazing, huh? Big war. And so it's one of those weird things that the battle that finally decided to be a United States happened in Canada. There were basically no colonists there. Yeah. Because they met in Paris. And I should add, Paris partially because Louis XIV was becoming the cultural center. And everybody liked going to Paris. Hey, when you're in doubt on a treaty, just put down the Treaty of Paris. You probably got a pretty good shot. Roll the die. As luck would have it, the next treaty, it's going to be the Treaty of Paris of 1783. Have a good day, everybody. Remember, I won't be here tomorrow. Fry room will be open. I will see you Friday, Thursday. I'm taking a 2-day break. Let's hope I don't. I figure out what happened again.
They say,
You can take a picture. You can take a
Are we gonna talk about the time that Britain stormed the White House?
Oh, yeah.
Heck, yeah.
Yeah. That'll be in a few weeks. War of 1812.
I do know a lot about history, mostly from YouTube, but from history. The only history I know is from history.
Which isn't really history.
It's not, duh. What kind of question is that?
So have a good day, everybody.
Adios.
You too, Mr. Partridge.
That's a water bottle.
Good luck. It was here before I
Oh.
came.
What's it there?
Good luck with the dentist.
It'll be fun.
Yup. We'll see how many teeth you have left.
I'll be gumming my food.